Right? I believe it's now recording. So it is recording, okay. So welcome everybody. We've got a large group here. This is the first of the Northeast Regional Environmental Acoustics Seminars. We have 3 scheduled for this semester. It's hosted by the University of New Hampshire. University of New Hampshire has unrolled a interdisciplinary vision and effort this year, and they've invested some internal money in topics that are interdisciplinary and reach out across UNH and outside of UNH and across the region. So we were lucky enough to obtain some funding and be awarded one of these core Collaborative Research Excellence and Initiative Awards to explore and build awareness and connectivity of environmental acoustics throughout the Northeast. And that's both underwater and terrestrial and air. So anybody doing anything that could be related or interested to any of those topics of acoustics are more than welcome to join. I see we've got probably close to 50 or even more people logged on right now, and we just encourage you to forward the flyers to anybody you think might be interested in the next seminar. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what you're going to see today in the seminar series, and then I'll introduce our speaker. So let me see if I can get to my, there we go. So the goals here for the seminar series are to build awareness and relationships between those actively involved in acoustics across UNH and the greater New England area. We have people logged in well outside the greater New England area, from Canada all the way down to Texas, I believe, judging by the people on the list that I recognized. And we were also hoping to engage stakeholders across other region and across the nation so we can get a better understanding of, or so they can get a better understanding of what type of research and efforts are in the Northeast region related to environmental acoustics. And, whoops, I have that later. We will have a symposium in March that will be open to everybody, and we'll be inviting stakeholders. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So we have 3 seminars once a month in September, October, November. Today we'll be hearing from John Buck. We'll be talking about information theory of humpback whale and leopard seal calling sequences. You guys all know that because you've tuned in. Next month will be Dan Howard talking about making high-stake decisions in complex acoustic environments, revisiting the cocktail, I can't get that little party problem in a multimodal sensory context. Let me see if I can I move that? I tried to hide it, it doesn't hide. Oh, there we go, how about that? Okay, there we go. And then I also wanted to, there was I think the URI group asked if we could just advertise another talk that will be related to environmental acoustics within the next 2 weeks at the University of Rhode Island. Jim Miller will be talking about acoustic and seismic measurements on the Block Island Wind Farm. And that's in Narragansett, Rhode Island. It's a night talk, so if you're close and would like to go to that, please know what's happening. Great. And with that, I just want to also say that I did not put this on here. There will be a symposium that sort of culminates in the region on March 20th. And that will be poster presentations of faculty and students. And then we'll have oral presentations by stakeholders. And we're inviting 2 keynote speakers. So that's in development, but I can at least tell you to put it on your save the date, March 20th. It'll run from about 8:30 in the morning till 5 o'clock in the evening. And there'll be breakfast and lunch included. And so just know that that will be coming, and we'll be planning that in the next few months. So with that, I'm going to introduce John Buck, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. John, you can now share your screen. So John is a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth in the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department. He's on sabbatical right now and at the University of Illinois. And he's part of the 6-person steering committee of this environmental working group. I should just name the 6 people on the steering committee, which is myself, Tony Lyons, Tom Weber, and Dan Howard from UNH, John Buck from UMass Dartmouth, and Holger Klink from Cornell. So with that, John, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to try and find my find my participant list and mute myself.
Okay, can everyone hear me there? Hopefully, someone will shout out in chat, I guess, because I'm in full screen mode if they can. So thank you all for coming to the first seminar, especially thank you to the 5 people I have in the room with me here, so I'm not feeling like an idiot talking to an empty room. I'm going to talk to you today about looking at information theory and ideas from electrical engineering and communications and what they can tell us about humpback whale and leopard seal calling sequences. A whole lot of acknowledgements before I get started. This work was done in collaboration with a lot of people. Ryuji Suzuki was a research student in my lab, developed a lot of the analysis methods that we'll be using. The humpback whale data came from Peter Tyak, and Roger Payne was his PhD advisor, provided us with that data. The leopard seal data and all the leopard seal sound and pictures I'll show you today was from Tracy Rogers at University of New South Wales, and Doug Cato collaborated with us. That was my 2 sabbaticals ago in 2003 and 4 that started. Jen also worked on some other humpback data that was collected with Michael Node was the PI for a large experiment at the University of Queensland. And at different times, NSF, the Fulbright Commission, and various Australian government agencies have all funded this work. So this is pulling together a lot of different projects from different places. Quick overview. We have an outline of, I'll tell a little bit about the marine mammal vocalizations. And I know there's a mixed audience, and some people may be familiar with the animal side, not so much with the engineering side, and vice versa. Then I'll talk a little bit of an overview about some of the information theory tools we use for estimating entropy and what that can tell us about a sequence of sounds, then the results for each and some conclusions. So humpback whales, the Megaterra nova angulae is the Latin name, means big-winged New Englander because of the very large pectoral fins. They live in most of the world's oceans, including, and not surprisingly, off the coast of New England, where I live. And one of the remarkable things about them is they sing these long, involved songs. What I have here for you is a spectrogram. This is time running across, frequency going up on a log scale. And for people that haven't seen it before, the bright colors like red and yellow indicate where the energy is. So if you like, you can think of this as mathematical sheet music. Just like sheet music goes from left to right and frequency goes up actually also on a log scale. This tells you where the notes are in a more continuous way. And I'm going to play for you. This is just 2 minutes of song, but I'm going to play for you and let you hear it while you can sort of follow along. All right, I'm going to hop over to iTunes and figure out why it's not playing the right sound. save that for later. So that's a long sequence of sounds, and when we're going to analyze these songs, we could transcribe this by the sounds are very stereotyped. So we could turn the sequence into something that went A, B, C, D, C, D, A, B, C, D, C, D, on like that. And then every once in a while, B gets repeated, and at some point we get about a dozen E's in a row down here and capture the sequence of sounds. As you saw, these are very complicated sound patterns. They have a broad frequency range from about 30 to 3 kilohertz. The songs change in different regions, different populations, but there are usually at least 12 different units, which are what we call those individual sounds separated by silence. Sometimes as many as 20. The song can go from 6 to 35 minutes and then loops around and goes back to the start again. And all the whales, all the males in a given herd are singing largely the same song at a time, though it usually slowly evolves over the season. But recently, about a dozen years ago, people in Australia found a case of a very rapid evolution, suggesting it is some kind of cultural phenomenon, and that all the East Coast whales rapidly adopted the West Coast song from the West Coast, some cross-fertilization that way. And you can read some of Mike Node's work if you're interested in that. In 1971, Roger Payne and Scott McVeigh proposed that Humpback song followed some kind of hierarchical structure. Let's see if I can move this out of the way without, I don't think I can, without blocking the top of my, well, hopefully it's not blocking all your screens. This hierarchical structure where a song is made up of a bunch of themes. Each of theme is a bunch of repeated phrases, and each of those phrases were a bunch of units. Is that coming out of my computer? Out of the speakers here? I did. I think it is in that speakers. I don't know why. I just say, well, Jen, are you hearing the beeping noise coming through?
Yes, we are. I'm trying to mute everybody. I'm going to mute everybody and then unmute you, okay?
Okay.
Yes. All right, so now how do I where'd he go? Oh, there he is. Oh. Okay, John, you are the only one unmuted.
Okay, and it seemed to have stopped the beeping, so that's good. All right. So they proposed this hierarchical structure for songs, and the interesting question is, was this really there, or do we see this because as humans we like to see things and organize them hierarchically, right? We could say any book is made up of chapters, that's made up of paragraphs that are made up of sentences that are made up of words. You know, music, Western music particularly, is often organized this way. And so there was some question about, in staring at lots of spectrograms, did Payne and McVeigh just impose their own sense of order on it, or is there really this structure here? And this was also controversial within the linguistics community. And as recently as about 15 years ago, Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch pointed out that suggested that the faculty of language in the narrow sense, which they mean the idea that a brain that can handle recursion, is recently evolved and unique to our species, which would say that if they were correct, no animal could organize their communications in this form. Since then, I will point out there have been some work in certain types of bird songs showing that some birds can at least handle some basic forms of recursion. They can be trained to recognize them. So let's switch over to leopard seals. Leopard seals produce long bouts of discrete stereotyped calls. They're largely solitary animals, and the males are widely spaced during the breeding season. These bouts, some people think they're territorial, some think they're attracting mates, that it's a mate, some think there's a role that's both of the above. But the sequence of sounds within the bout is what is hypothesized to be individual identity. So unlike the humpbacks, where they're all making the same sounds in pretty much the same order, the leopard seals are making the same sounds, but in individually distinctive patterns. And that seems to be their identity view. So now I'll play you a bit of leopard seal. That's a descending trill. That's a high double trill. There's 3 other types. That's a low. It's either a mid or a hoot. And now here's a little segment of them all naturally run together. Very leisurely. There's another part. So you can see they're very well spaced out. So it goes on like that, but again, we could take those very stereotyped calls and translate it into a sequence of symbols. One thing that's a little different from the leopard seals, from the humpback whales, is leopard seals do have even bigger than the gaps you heard, which is sort of their normal rhythm. There are big bouts of silence where they stop. And there seems to be information possibly in the start and stop of the sequence. So we also use Z to indicate a break and transmission, where the humpbacks pretty much seem to go almost nonstop once they get going. So we're going to focus on three main research questions about the order of units in the sequence. What kind of model approximates the sequence structure? And I like the idea of this talk because we can sort of show the different ideas for humpbacks and leopard seals. Humpback songs, are they hierarchically structured, or was that observer bias? And leopard seals, is the sequence really mainly just about first order transitions, which we'll talk about in a minute, Markov models. While we're doing it sort of for free, we'll get how much information could there be in the song? And can we really tell individual leopard seals from the transition probabilities? And the way we'll do that is using information theory. But before I do that, let me crush everybody's hopes. I'm not going to tell you the secret language of the whales today. In fact, as far as we know, there isn't one. Roger Payne, who might be one of the world's leading authorities and has spent more time listening to them, in his book Among Whales, pointed out that basically we just don't know. And the other tricky thing when you start working with information theory, George Miller was a psychologist and one of the pioneers of cognitive science as such, took pains early on to point out that when you measure information theory, you're measuring the amount of information, and it tells you nothing about value or meaning. So we can't use this necessarily to say how true or how important something is. Okay, so again, our basic approach, we're going to start with the sound sequence and translate the symbols. We're then going to take the symbol sequence and we're going to estimate something called the entropy, which I'll define for you in a second. And then by comparing different ways of estimating the entropy, we'll be able to make conclusions about how the sequence of sounds are put together. And so today we're mainly just going to focus on steps 2 and 3. We're going to assume whether it's, we've gotten things transcribed. These days we could probably do a lot with machine learning. When a lot of this work was done, we were hiring music students to spend the summer transcribing whale songs, and also many of the grad students and postdocs involved did as well. So when we do that, the song becomes the sequence of discrete random variables, each of which has some probability. So there's some probability in a whale song I get an A, a B, or so on in the nth possession. Entropy measures how unpredictable the sequence is, how unexpected it is. And the entropy of a sequence of n symbols is the sum minus the sum over every possible sequence of the probability of that sequence times the log base 2 of that sequence, of that probability. Or if you like thinking expectations, you can say minus the expected value of log p. The entropy rate of a source, like a whale or a seal, is basically the limit as the sequence gets infinitely long of the total uncertainty divided by the number of symbols. So it's sort of an average per letter uncertainty is the entropy rate. You say, well, how does that help us? Those are fine definitions. Entropy has some important properties which provide insights into an information source. First of all, it's an upper bound on how much information that could be there. We don't know what it is. You can make entropy by flipping a fair coin and get very good binary entropy without having information there. But if there is information there, this is an upper bound on how much communication can be going on. The more constrained the source is, the lower the entropy is. And that makes sense because if something's constrained, it's only allowed to do certain things, it gets more predictable, so there's less uncertainty. So intuitively, that's sensible. And when we try to model a source, a model who has a good structure to fit the source has a lower entropy estimate, which again makes sense, because if it has a good structure or good model, it's reducing uncertainty. It's doing a good job of predicting what's going on. So we'll use that third property. And this picture at the bottom is Claude Shannon, who was the pioneering inventor of information theory at Bell Labs, playing with a robotic mouse and a maze he made, actually, in that picture. He made the mouse and the maze, I should say. So what we're going to focus on is a problem called blind entropy estimation, because those equations I showed you 2 slides ago are great, but we can't go look at the whale and say, what's the probability that you say, after, or something like that. We need to estimate it from the data. And so how do we do that? The first thing is what's called a parametric model, where we assume some model, and then we try to estimate its parameters, which in this case are the probabilities. The 2 we'll look at are the independent identically distributed, or IID model, which assumes each sound is just one after the other with no connection. It's almost sort of a straw man we have to get out of the way first. You can think of it as if the whale or the seal were just picking sounds out of a hat. Maybe not all equally likely, but there's no time dependence to it. And then we'll look at a first order Markov model, which says the next sound depends on the previous sound, but nothing before that. And so there's a dependency of 1 there, but nothing earlier. And then later we'll switch to look at the non-parametric model. We'll look at ways for estimating entropy without having to estimate those probabilities. And a particular one called the sliding window match length. So for the IID model, the source thing simplifies, which makes sense if there's no time dependence, to just summing up minus the sum over the alphabet of p log p. So I say I just need the probability of each sound or symbol. I can do that by looking at a sequence of data and just counting how many H's, how many L's, whatever there are, and I substitute those in and get an estimate of the entropy. For the first order Markov model, it's the same basic thing, only I count all the pairs or diagrams, as Shannon originally called them. And by having all the pairs, I can get the joint probability and the conditional probability. And that gives me what I'll call the Markov estimate of entropy. So how does that help me? Well, I can compare the 2 estimates and tell me something about it. If the Markov estimate is less than the IID estimate, that says knowing the last sound helps me predict the next one, right? That there is time structure. If they're about the same, knowing that this current sound doesn't help me predict the next one. And so just as a sort of toy example, these are synthetic sources I made up. If I have a source with just 2 letters, A's and B's, I could make a sequence that looks like this. I go through and say, how many A's are there? How many B's are there? In this case, about the same number in my sequence. The IID says that works out when I plug into the equation to give me 1 bit of entropy. I count all the pairs and all 4 possible pairs, AA, AB, BA, and BB are all equally likely. I plug that in, and the Markov source says, well, it's again almost an entropy of 1. And that's good because the true entropy is 1. This was actually just a coin flip between A and B. If I go to the next one, I'll see an equal number of A and B, so I'll still see 1 for the IID. However, all the pairs are not equally likely. If you look at it, you can even get a sense here. You're much more likely to alternate than repeat in this sequence. And this is a first order Markov model where that's true. They're much more likely to flip back and forth than repeat. And my estimate when I plug those probabilities based on counting into the Markov model is about 0.74. The true entry is about 0.72 because I know, because I made the Markov model, I know the probabilities. But here's where we get into a problem. If I go to this third one, all the letters are equally likely, all the pairs are equally likely, but it's a second order Markov model where all the triplets are not equally likely. And so we say, well, it seems that the pursuit of Markov models is one of infinite regress, right? There's always a bigger Markov model. And that's where we get into problems when we're working from real data. It's just to look at the leopard seal case, there's only about 6 different sounds, including the pause, or 6 different symbols. So for an IID model, I need 6 probabilities. I can probably get that out of the data. The first order Markov model has 6 squared, or 36 probabilities. But if I wanted to get a second order Markov model, I need 6 to the third, or 216 possible triplets. And that's not likely to happen on a good day in the field of leopard seal. You heard how leisurely those are. You're lucky to get about 200 units at most, maybe a little, sometimes you get more, but before either the seal leaves or another seal comes in and they're interfering with each other. Humpbacks are even worse because we're going to have, instead of raising 6, it's going to be something like 12 or 20 to the power. And we can sometimes record them for longer, but again, not enough to reliably get second and third order Markov models. So what are we going to do? We need another approach. And what we do is we use the idea that low entropy sources create sequences with long repeated sequences. If you're an engineer, you may have heard of the idea of a typical set, if you've ever studied communication, right? That says that the lower the entropy is, the fewer things you typically see out of the source. Well, if you're not seeing many things, it means it's got to be repeating itself a lot. And so we can play this counting game. We can say, I'm going to pick, at each point in the sequence, I'm going to look at the subsequence going forward. And I'm going to look for the longest match I can find to that inside a window that's right before this point in time. So here I'm looking for the match a sequence that begins A, B, A, C. As I scroll backwards, in this example, my window size is 10. I've got AB, that's a match of 2. ABA is a match of 3. ABA, again, is another 3. This ABAC is a longer match of 4, but I can't count it because it didn't start within the window. It has to start within the window. So for this example, for window size 10, at this point in the sequence, I get a match 3. And our intuition is, if there are not many things I can say, if I have low entropy, I'm going to say this, a lot of the same things over and over again. I'm going to see lots longer matches. So you say, that's a nice intuition. Can I quantify it? Can I make it more precise? Luckily, I don't have to, because Weiner and Ziv already did. In 1989, they published a paper showing that for a large class of sources, the average or expected match length as a function of window size divided by the log of the window size is like 1 over the entropy plus an error term that goes like 1 over the log of the window size. And so this says if I have a sequence of data, I can just play that counting game like we just played, or better still, teach a computer to play that counting game at each point in the sequence and get an estimate of a sample estimate of the average match length and solve this equation for H while recognizing there's going to be a little bit of bias. But if I can let the window get big enough, the bias will get smaller and smaller. And this gives me what we'll call the sliding window match length. So it's a way of estimating the entropy without having to estimate 216 or 400 probabilities, which tells us something about, well, is the Markov cap, if they met, oh, getting ahead of myself. So that leads us to the second step in our entropy comparison, which is if the sliding window entropy is less than that first order Markov, we know that there's still more information the first order Markov is not capturing, more structure than we have there. But if they're about the same, that says the first order Markov model is capturing most of the structure of the sequence. So that's sort of a quick tour of, there's a lot more to information theory than that, but that's the few pieces of information theory we're using to study this. So let's come back to the marine mammals. The Humpback data set we studied, this was for a paper published in 2006 with Ryuji Suzuki and Peter Tyack. This was recorded in the 1970s off Hawaii as part of Peter Tyak's thesis work. We needed long songs. We were able to find 16 that were more than 300 units. And like I said, this is data Peter has previously published. I forgot an image credit. This is a Wikipedia image comment. Thank you for that. Dramatic whale picture. So again, the first test, I'm going to reiterate this just for people that aren't familiar. If Markov is less than IID, there is sequence. If they're about the same, there's not. And we ran this with some bootstrapping tests to get confidence intervals on the IID estimates. So here's each song across the bottom. Maybe it's better if I use the mouse so you can all see the cursor. So here's 16 different songs. This is the entropy in bits. The blue circles are the IID estimates, and the red squares are the Markov model for the same song. And then these are 95% confidence bounds around the IID. And what we found is in every case, the Markov model is much less than the IID, which again, shouldn't be surprising. Just from the little bit of the song I played you, you could start to say, well, maybe I wouldn't be always right, but I could guess with better than random chance accuracy what was coming next. And then the next step is we compare these against the sliding window against the Markov ones to say, well, is the Markov capturing everything? So now I've got the Markov, again, same graph format, song number here, entropy here. The Markov are the red squares now with confidence bounds, and the sliding window are the green diamonds. And we see that in this case, it's sort of a mixed bag, but more than half the sliding window estimates are outside the confidence bounds, which means that many of these songs have more structure to them than that. And in fact, for the people that are maybe a little more familiar with estimators, it's probably more significant than that because the sliding window match length has a positive bias and the plug-in Markov has a negative bias. So these places where they're barely overlapping, we don't have a good way to correct the bias and reject them, but it does suggest that that we're saying, well, it's almost significant even in these cases, and the biases suggest there probably is still more information there. So we say, well, that proves that it's more information than first order Markov, but how do we know it's not just the third order Markov or fourth order Markov we don't have the data for? So what else can we look at? We can look at a sort of a strange kind of autocorrelation, right? Normally when we correlate two things, we multiply them and then add or integrate with a shift in time. But for categorical data, there's a discrete autocorrelation, which is that I take the two sequences, I say what fraction are equal, basically. So I shift this one sequence relative to the other. If it were perfectly periodic, it would line up again on the period and R would go back to 1. And so for this, here's sort of, again, a toy example. I took this sequence, I shifted it 4 to the right, and I just look, I'd say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 out of 15 line up. So here, this would be, R would be, 11 15ths. Well, I'd have to correct the bias in front. But you get the idea. You count matches looking for periodicities, and it works well for categorical data. Why does that help us? Well, any Markov model generates, once it's in steady state, generates a stationary sequence, right? One of the properties of, basic property of a stationary sequence is the autocorrelation doesn't own a watch, that it's the same autocorrelation no matter where you are in the sequence. So it says if I took this chunk here early in the sequence and shifted it and correlated it, the answer is if I took this chunk and shifted it, if the sequence is Markov. And so we did that with the whale song. We did short time autocorrelations for 2 sections. Again, early in the song is red, late in the song here. This is the lag, or how far I shifted one signal relative to the other against the log correlation. And for small values, they're not too different. We could get into more detailed discussions about when is this statistically significant. But by the time you shift by 100, they're really clearly not the same correlation function. To reject that. So we can look at this and say, there's a clearly different correlation behavior at different times in the sequence. It's not a stationary source. So no Markov model could make this sequence. Short of I guess there's always the trivial pathological Markov model whose order is the length of the sequence. So we could have 1,000 order Markov model could make the sequence. So that's sort of a pathological case. And we then went and looked at the autocorrelation of the sequences themselves over long time scales. Oh, I should have pointed one other thing out here. If you look carefully, these sort of sawtooths repeat about every 5 or 6 symbols, which is about the typical phrase length we see as we go through that. If we look at the whole sequence, we see 2 things going on. What was that sawtooth is now a blur. There's this short time period of about 5, and then we see very long time scales, but it changes in the song commensurate with the fact that the song length changes as the song evolves over the season. So earlier in the season in December, it was relatively short, about 175 units on average. And by May, it was dragged out to about 350 or 400 units long. So we can certainly use the autocorrelation to get properties. And this is consistent with a hierarchical model. We would see repetitions on the phrase length, then we'd see repetitions on the overall song length. So it is not something where we can say conclusively we can't reject everything else, but it is consistent with the hierarchical model. So in contrast, now let's look at leopard seals. This is data Tracy Rogers recorded in the early and mid 1990s. She had 35 singers making about 1,100 bouts and over 11,000 sounds in this data set, including the 2002 recording where she looked at individual identifiability. So again, same first comparison, IID versus Markov. Unfortunately, because of the different analysis, I apologize, it's different symbols now. So now green triangle is IID, blue circle is Markov. You can tell I've never put these all in the same talk before. And the same confidence bounds idea. And we see again, in every case that the entropies are lower than they were for the IID, but they're all still significantly different. All 35, and here I ordered them from longest to shortest, are outside the 95% confidence interval. So again, the sequence does have time structure to it. They're not just picking calls out of a hat. But in this case, we see there's probably on the whole, there's still some that are significantly different, but less so. And the ones that are, there's a few that are around the edges, but a lot of these are really solidly not significant. It's saying the entropy is almost the same with either model. In some cases, it actually gets reversed because of the biases. So in some of these song cases, it really does seem to be exactly first order Markov. So 21 of the 35 here are not significant, which would not happen by chance if they were just randomly generated sounds. But it seems that there's most of the information or most of the structure is captured by first order Markov model for leopard seal. And so to finish up, I'm going to say a little bit about the individual thing. Tracy and Doug analyzed a subset of this data where they knew exactly which seal was singing, because they're normally under the water. They are the top predator, so you don't mess with them lightly. They are, in fact, I know scientific divers who will work around sharks who will not get in the water with leopard seals. The leopard seals are so dangerous and so sneaky, particularly. They say it's not just that they're dangerous, but they're sneakier than most predators. But what Tracy would do is sneak up on them while they were hauled out on the ice and hit them with a paint gun to get color on them so that when they were in the water, she could tell, and it would be non-toxic paint. It all washed off. She had all the permits to do this. That would let her see who it was. And so for the subset where we know exactly which animal was singing, she looked at a bunch of just summary features like how long was the bout, how many H's in the bout, how many L's, how many HL transitions versus LH, and was able to do sort of a PCA and found that 93% of the variance was explained by two things that mainly had to do with how many H's, L's versus LH, and how long the bout was, to get about 83% classification. But the problem with this is sort of assumes the animal can count bouts and things like that. Counting means recursion. We were curious with just the first order Markov model, how well could you identify them? So once we saw this, so we said for each of the 5 seals, we estimated these probabilities, the conditional probability of X of n given X of n minus 1. So we had 5 different seals. We had 5 different transition matrices. And then we went back and we took the sequences and we said for each sequence, which transition matrix maximizes this conditional probability, where this is a likelihood function. So given the data we saw, which of the 5 transition matrices was most likely to have produced that data, that correctly still classified about 85% of the singers. So just knowing single sound transitions is enough to get an individual identity out of these things, as well as if you knew how long the average bout was. So with less computational complexity, you can still get as much individual identity. Oops, wrong way. All right, so to finish up, some couple conclusions to wrap up for you with humpback whales. The Markov model entropy is less than the IID, which means the songs have sequential structure. The songs are non-stationary, so no regular Markov model source with it shorter than the song could model them. They have repetitive nature. They have these periods of 6 and 200 that's consistent with Payne and McVeigh's structure. And on the whole, they convey less than 1 bit of information. So it's, those of you in the audience old enough to remember how exciting it was to get a 2400 bit per second modem. If the whale was a modem, you wouldn't buy it, right? You can do a lot better at getting information transmitted by sound. Leopard seals, a couple conclusions there. The sequential structure is mostly captured by first order Markov models, though there are a few calling bouts that seem to have a little more structure than just first order. But Markov models let us identify the singers as well as a sort of PCA-based discriminant analysis that assumes the knowledge of the summary statistics of the whole bout and not just the most recent transitions one at a time. And I will stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Nice, John. Very good.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks. You got applause here too. It's hard to hear your applause, but I should let you know, John, that based on my calculations with the number of people logged on and the number of people who said there's multiple people in the room, we're up to a minimum of 92 people who just
That's pretty good. Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
were able to hear you speak. So at this point, I think that if anybody has questions, they can unmute themselves and ask, or they can use the chat room, and I can relay the question. So, what?
Unmute at the same time.
Okay, why don't we do that? We were trying to figure out the best way to ask questions. So if you have a question, please type it into the chat, and then I can repeat it to everybody, and John can answer. So if anybody has questions, type them on in. So one question came in. How does this compare to things like birds?
I don't know the bird literature very well. There's Beecher did a study using entropy to prove that there was enough information in, I think it was a swallow species, that explained how the parents could find their young. People have looked at birds for things like grammar structure. I don't know that there's been many estimating entropy. And I also have to admit, this is work that was done and funded mostly 5 to 8 years ago. So I haven't followed all the bird literature closely. So if someone else knows more, I'd be happy to hear it.
Give a chance for anybody to unmute themselves that may know more about this question from the bird view. And then the next question is, it's a two-part question. Is this research still ongoing, and are you still recording calls?
It's not ongoing. I am not. I am a data scavenger for the most part. I've worked with other people's old data. We're not actively recording. I don't think Tracy is actively in the field. Mike Node is still recording in Queensland. They have done an ongoing thing recording humpbacks, but right now we don't have any funding to pursue further analysis. So this is off and on kind of my scientific hobby, including we've never actually really published the leopard seal data. I need to sometime find time to write it up. Tracy has been very patient and long suffering about me not getting it written.
Other questions?
Rebecca Dunlop actually does this with the social calls to her grad student. When Melinda was a grad student with her, she did this with social calls in Australia, on the Australian data.
Rebecca Dunlop, I just got from here in UNH in the room, there was a response to that too, that Rebecca Dunlop is continuing to do this type of analysis on social calls of humpbacks as opposed to the song.
Yes, and Ellen Garland actually just published a really interesting paper showing that supports the seems to support the hierarchical stuff, showing that when the song evolves, they seem to switch out one theme at a time, so they get hybrid songs that are on theme boundaries. But yeah, Rebecca is also now at University of Queensland. 14 years ago, she was a postdoc volunteer at the Australian humpback recording, and she's gone on to get addicted to humpbacks and is now a faculty member at University of Queensland working on social calls and other parts of it.
There's another question. If you did a similar analysis of human speech, how many bits of information would there be? How fast is a modem?
Andy might remember better. Shannon did that with written language. I don't remember if he did spoken. It was about 1 bit per second, or was for a newsreader. Is that remembering about? At least that's the right order of magnitude. It was at most 10 bits a second.
Okay. Oops, I think I just.
Wait, we have an expert in the room here who might have a better.
Okay. I can't. How do I don't want it to.
Yeah.
It says Mark.
How do I get that out? Oh, sorry.
But the constraints usually. Shannon did the guessing game experiments where he made people guess the next letter and the next word. I seem to remember up with things on the order of the equivalent of 10 bits or less per second.
I would venture that it's probably less than 10 bits per second.
So the intuition is human language is probably a bit more complicated, but not 100 times better.
Maybe one.
Yeah, a fast talker from New York might be 2 orders of magnitude better than a leisurely male.
Okay, so I'm looking at the next question. It says, does the 1 bit per unit measurement just relate to the coded phrases? Could there be subtle differences between phrases coded the same that might increase the information content?
Yes, and I meant to say that. That's an excellent question. I meant to say that during the talk, that we are necessarily restricting ourselves to the sequence of sounds. And as humans, we do that all the time, right? I could say the same thing, same words, 2 different ways and have different information. I could say, that was a great talk. I could say, that was a great talk, right? Same word, different information. So we could be losing information that has to do with that. People have looked a little bit at humpbacks with the rhythm and the sound gaps, like the sort of rhythm and tempo of them. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of information there. Widow had students looking at that for a bit, but so there could be things in that, although as an acoustician, I'm skeptical how much because those sort of subtle things in frequency content would not be that robust to the acoustic channel over tens of kilometers that the animals are communicating over. Andy just looked it up. It's about 12 bits per word. Is that spoken or written English? Okay. Well, but you need spoken to get per second then. How many words per second? So 12 bits per word, and then how fast can you talk? Yes, so there are regional variations.
Okay, here's a temporal variation question. You briefly mentioned that there were a few differences in entropy among seasons in regard to humpback whale calls. Has the entropy in relation to seasonality been researched further?
Not that I'm aware of. When we did the first data set, this whole data set, it was interesting that there seemed to be a competing thing that as the song got longer, it got simpler and the entropy went down. We were wondering if there was a conservation principle. We looked at whether the sort of total bits per song was some measure of how much memory the humpback had. But that didn't seem to be conserved. And in fact, Jen later did that same analysis for later Australian data, and it was not some kind of beautiful constant, because if it was, it would have been published in Science and you would have all heard about it if we'd been able to all humpback songs conserved information. But in terms of the seasonal thing, I don't think anyone's looked in. You'd certainly have to adjust seasons, northern and southern hemisphere. And another trick with that is we don't record the whale in the same phase of their life cycle in different places. In Hawaii, most of the recordings are in Hawaii, which is the summer breeding grounds, or sorry, the winter breeding grounds before they swim to Alaska and eat for the summer. In Australia, most of the recordings are during the migration, either coming to or they're transitioning between the two places. So it's sort of at a different point. If there is a seasonal connection, we don't have a lot of data at the same point in the annual cycle from different places in the world.
That's a good, yeah, that's a good summary, because I was going to say the same thing. Can you go back to the previous slide? Someone wanted to see the conclusions of the humpbacks. It went by a little fast. And while you're doing that, the next question was, could you use this design to design autocorrect for humpback whale song?
Well, autocorrect or auto-tune? We could, well, the autocorrect itself is an interesting question. You could do that, but again, sometimes what carries information is the unpredictable thing, right? To bring up, the thing, and in markets, that kind of entropy makes you money, right? If it's not insider trading and puts you in jail. If I could have told you that 5 minutes into the third quarter of last year's Super Bowl, the Patriots would win, you could have gone to Las Vegas and gotten very good odds at that point. So that's something, information you can really bank on. So you want to be careful about autocorrect versus you could try to guess what should have been next, but they do innovate the song. One of the long-term goals I'd love to get to, and we'd hoped at one point, is what is the right measure of rate of change of a song? How do you talk about, do the songs maybe evolve at different rates in different populations or at different times of year? How do you talk about, in terms of bits per week or something, how the structure of the song, how rapidly it's changing, and is that consistent? We were wondering about that before Mike Node found this sort of rapid phase transition. So there clearly are different rates of evolution at different places at different times. But I have a question in the room here, Andy.
So some of your analysis assumes organicity of your market.
Yes.
And these are short songs. So how have you looked at, and if you haven't looked at, can you explain how some of your conclusions might change if you didn't just start properties working in steady state, but rather had they all had a comment.
Can you repeat the question? We can't hear anything.
I will. It's a long question. He's still going. I will repeat. Right. Right. So Andy's question is basically, have we looked at, we're assuming things are in steady state and ergodic. In many of our communications, they're not. He said, often when you start a phone call, you say, hello, my name is this, or hello, this is Andy. And in fact, these were exactly the vulnerabilities people used to attack Enigma in World War II, is there was always a weather thing at the start. right, and a time of day and things like that. We didn't look at that. So it may be that the Humpback song seems to be cyclostationary, that they just pick up and sing around that cycle over and over again. Well, it might be that they are actually saying, reminding the potential mate who is speaking. We haven't really looked at that. I don't know how to account for that. I mean, if they're not, we shouldn't even be using the sliding window, right? The sliding window estimate. Although we do that, we do have a technical thing where we look over, for the sliding window, we take a whole range of window sizes, because if you change the window size, you're trading off bias for stationarity or non-stationary. Yep. Yes, the process is clearly cyclostationary from the correlations.
Does it appear that it's just repeating itself?
It seems to, but again, these are things we would need a larger data set of longer songs to probably get at in the statistical sense.
We have one more question from the group, and I think we're going to have to sign off at 1, but I definitely encourage people who are in rooms with other people while viewing to continue this conversation offline. But the last question for the group, John, it says, I'm surprised that the seals can be predicted by a low order Markov model. What type of information do you think they may be conveying by vocalizing?
Well, again, it seems consistent with what the previous suggestions. I'm going to scroll back to the start about seals. Whether it's some combination of territorial display and mate attraction. So it is apparently largely identity. I guess the other thing I didn't mention, the seals are also about 1 bit per symbol. The average bout length for a seal is about 10 sounds. So that would be about 10 bits, which is enough to make more than about 1,000 distinguishable, typical set of more than 1,000 different sequences. And that's way more than enough to cover the number of seals they would ever heal. Here, the population of seals, their sort of acoustic range is not many thousands. So it's at least consistent. The numbers are on the back of an envelope way consistent with the seals just broadcasting identity to either warn off other males or attract mates.
Well, thank you, everybody. We've hit our pretty much 1 o'clock time period.
Right.
I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. And John, thank you especially for doing our first presentation. We hope to see that everybody is back here again at the same time in October. It's the second Tuesday of the month from noon to 1, and it'll be a terrestrial acoustic talk next time.
Thanks, Jan.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Hey, John, are you out in Illinois right now?
Yes, I am.
I'll email you. We got a weird question that's turned up. All right.
Okay.
I was
Jim.
never here.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
I did hear, will the recording be available? Yes, the recording will be available on our working group website once it's up in a few weeks, and I will let everybody know when that happens, hopefully by the next seminar in October.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye. Signing off.
Thank you. Someone asked, will the list of attendees be available? That's going to be hard to do because I don't know the names of everybody that just logged in with symbols or letters and so forth. So I don't think that I will be able to distribute a list of attendees. Oh, 6. We were up over 100 now based on the numbers of the multiple peoples in the room. So that was a really good turnout for our first seminar. So thank you, everybody. And I am going to end this meeting, and perhaps we could ask some folks to join a listserv. Yes, we can. As soon as I can get a website and people can log in for a listserv, I can do that. All right. Thank you very much, and I'm going to end this meeting. See you guys in October. Thank you, John. Oh, yeah, I got to end the recording first. Thank you. Let's see how I do that.